Welcome everybody to the final CUHK seminar of the semester in the, I think, the smallest room at CityU. We strive at CUHK for an intimate atmosphere, and I think we're getting very increasingly successful at that. We're very pleased to have with us today Ian Morley, who's an assistant professor of urban history in the Department of History at CUHK in the Urban Studies program. And I should mention we met, it's almost 2 years ago now, at a conference. And we kept,
really hot day in Vienna.
We kept talking about Ian coming over for a seminar, and it's finally happened. It's almost 2 years. Well, we're happy. Whatever takes a while is worth waiting for. So he's published widely on design on built environments during the late 1800s and early 1900s. And from 2009 to 2014, he was book review editor for Urban Morphology. He's currently on the editorial board of the journal Planning Perspectives, as well as a council member of the International Planning History Society. And very notably, he's the recipient of the History Department Teaching Award for a number of years. Ian, it's great that you could come here today, and I find this topic a fascinating one, bringing through the colonial heritages and the contemporary situation in the Philippines, which might be addressed indirectly anyway through some of the issues you're raising. So thanks for coming. Appreciate your coming next door.
Thank you. I again apologise that it's taken so long. And I should apologise as well. My phone keeps beeping. It's my birthday today, so thank you. So if it keeps beeping, please ignore it. And I've switched it off, but for some reason it still keeps buzzing. So thank you again for the introduction. So what I really do is I'll provide an overview of, this was a project that was supported by the GRF here in Hong Kong. Finished towards the end of 2015, and hopefully it's coming out very soon with the University of Hawaii Press in a monograph, which we titled Cities and Nationhood, American Imperialism and Urban Design in the Philippines, 1898 to 1916. And it's been followed up by another project with a Filipino called Gerard Lico, who I'm sure Mark's familiar with. He did work on the Marcos architecture in particular. Anyway, so this is my abstract. So I'm really interested, or what I will go through today is the importation of modern American urban design, principally the city beautiful, and urban design practices during the opening decades of the 20th century, and that they fundamentally redefined the environmental form of cities in the Philippines. Although it's acknowledged that the introduction of the city beautiful led to the endorsement of spatial forms dissimilar to what had previously existed, not much is currently known about why city planning became such a fundamental component of governance at that time, and what impact urban design had upon local civilization and the construction of nationhood. So consequently, my talk today will investigate the form and meaning of what I've called the first generation of city beautiful projects that were implemented up to 1916 as part of America's, and again I call it the early colonial administration of the Philippines. Why 1916 is important, because then you get the Filipinos administering themselves. So this is really about American whites, to be more precise in racial terms. Now, if you're familiar with city history, then the early 20th century is an era of really great importance in terms of the evolution of city design practices. And there was really evolutions that were made in a number of continents, both North and South America, in Asia, Australasia, and in Europe, with respect to the changing appearance and plan of cities. Notable at that time was the international dissemination of urban design practices. Two really stand out: the Garden City, which is the British housing model, and then in terms of, say, central design, the central district design, that's then the American City Beautiful, which of course originated in the US but affected city design conventions outside of North America. Just to really give you a brief example of this, it influenced architects and planners in places as culturally diverse and geographically far afield as Argentina, Australia, Britain, Canada, China, Cuba, Panama, and the Philippines. Yet, notwithstanding the advent of city beautiful urbanism in the Philippines during the early 1900s, little is currently known about its implications for American colonization and the development of Philippine nationalism. Now, in order to really, again, go back to historical basics, in order to really understand when and where the first cohort of Asian City Beautiful schemes commenced, we've really got to understand two military-related events. The first is in Havana, Cuba, in February 1898, which was the sinking of the USS Maine. And the second event on May the 1st, 1898, which was the Battle of Manila Bay. And these were basically two events that were important in the build-up and intensification of what was called the Spanish-American War. A conflict that ultimately led by December 1898 to the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which consequently meant that Spain relinquished its authority in Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. To be more precise, Americans bought the Philippines. And of course, the transfer of colonial rule in the Philippines Islands meant that the character of local society was fundamentally revised in the years that followed. By 1905, for example, the American colonial government had enacted a policy to restructure local cities. So again, very, very early on, there's a attention by the Americans in the Philippines to changing the environmental form of cities. However, with regard to the introduction of modern urban planning, there's still much to learn about how it contributed to the American transformation of Philippine society. So against that backdrop, this talk, I hope, seeks to explore, or at least introduce, the relationship between imperial notions of spatial design and the maturation of the new Filipino nation after 1898. Accordingly, it presents an examination of the impact of urban design practice upon both the evolution of the Philippines and the development of the Philippine nation. And what I mean by that is the shared sentiment of being Filipino, which obviously was a sentiment that existed prior to the onset of American colonial rule in 1898. But significantly, in this historical context, I argue that city planning was not merely a tool to transform urban space in order to socially engineer society to a happier, healthier, wealthier, and more sophisticated cultural state of being. Rather, I contend that city planning was applied to facilitate what the Americans saw as the formation of nationhood in the Philippine Islands, and therefore nationalism in this colonial construct was obviously promoted by the Americans. So to help explain these matters, I'll now put forward information with respect to the emergence of modern urban design in America, and then the development of the Philippine society at the end of the 1800s and start of the 1900s. And as I've said, that's between 1898 and the passing of the Philippine Autonomy Act, which is sometimes called the Jones Act, in 1916, which for the first time gave legislative authority and governmental responsibility to Filipinos. So that's why I've called it the kind of early administration of the Philippines. So as I've said, in terms of America, towards the end of the 19th century, there was a number of important developments that affected the design and meaning of cities. Among these advances was a nationalization of taste, a matter that emphasized aesthetic faults in existing built environments and encouraged architects/planners to take on more responsibility in directing contemporary urban growth. A shift therefore arose in the understanding of the function and the worth of urban design. As a result, city planning was recognized as a means to not only configure urban environments, but to also elevate social conditions in the US. Central to this change was a reform group known as the City Beautiful movement, which ventured to resolve social and environmental defects evident in urban communities, problems like crime, corruption, squalid and unhealthy living conditions in particular. And it was aroused by the French Beaux-Arts concept of urban design. But this movement was important in it bequeathed by the early 1900s a new urban design vision for American society. And in promoting this vision, the City Beautiful movement perceived urban planning and citizenship to be aligned with each other. In other words, beautiful cities denoted moral, intellectual, and governmental progress. Significantly, two beautiful cities manufactured what was labelled at the start of the last century as social religion, a sentiment which united people together as members of a community. Now, in order to understand transitions with respect to the rise of the City Beautiful, there's two cities that stand out, Chicago and Washington, D.C. With respect to Chicago, the World's Columbian Exposition was held in the city in 1893, which, despite being a temporary event, redirected the urban design narrative in the US. It was the largest cultural event that had been ever held in the US at that time, and it was one in which a large number of enormously sized buildings were laid out in an axial arrangement. Basically, the environment of the exposition showcased the prudence of diligently positioning buildings, statues, and spaces within an urban setting. This was an environment that was designed by the architect Daniel Burnham. We're going to talk a lot about Burnham today, with assistance from the landscape designer Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. And again, the environment of the exposition, you can see the Court of Honor, proved to be an object lesson in formulating an urban plan. It demonstrated explicitly to American people the effectiveness of the grouping of buildings in orderly relations to each other. The impressive nature of the event had far-reaching impacts that touched upon dynamics that were shaping American society at that time, namely wealth, culture, and power. But importantly too, the exposition illustrated that modern civilization could be distilled into a spatial form manufactured by a trained individual, namely the architect-planner. And hence, all that was necessary to ameliorate society was an opportunity to implement a grand plan within an existing settlement. And in 1901, that chance arose within arguably the most important American city, which is Washington, D.C. The Macmillan Plan of 1901-2 was designed by Daniel Burnham with assistance from Law Olmsted Jr., also Charles McKim, and Augustus St. Gaudens. And again, the Macmillan Plan bestowed a fresh peek in modern American urban designing. It aroused the imagination of the public, and under the organization of the Senate Park Commission, it transformed the national capital into a model environment. Its aggrandizement also aroused much patriotic fervor on account of the city being rehabilitated during an age when American nationalism was enlarging. The renewed environment evoked an image of imperial splendor deemed pertinent to the capital of the emerging American empire. As a place exemplifying its nation's identity, status, and growing international power, the revamped city with its large open spaces and grand vistas towards prominent public buildings and monuments incited the public to venerate individuals and institutions allied to the history, evolution, and distinctive character of American society. And to appreciate how, well, this is a very important image because of clearly the current president, well, we won't go there, but we know how it is. But to appreciate how this sentiment was to transpire, then attention can be put on one environmental feature, the Mall. It's about 3 kilometers long, 240 meters wide. It's the principal open area within the center of the city. And if you do visit, it provides an incredible view, magnificent view to the most important public building in the US, that is the Capitol. Based on the example of the Macmillan Plan, similar green spaces were proposed in a host of other American settlements, Philadelphia, Cleveland, St. Louis, for instance. And because municipal administrations at that time were venturing to display civic advancement, such features came to define what modern American city designing was about. To be a bit more precise, it's about the creation of grandiose architectonic productions. That's to say, processional sequences of spaces and buildings arranged as orderly units as modelled on the theories and practices of Daniel Burnham. Moreover, because in City Beautiful thinking, citizenship was purportedly nurtured by urban planning, to systematically arrange buildings, roads, and urban spaces into an organised form equated to the fabrication of an elevated type of American citizen. As I'll discuss in the next part of this presentation, the notion of uplifting people, that is, the elevation of society through the use of urban design, was evident not only in North America, but by the early 1900s in the Philippines, that's to say, the newly acquired territory of the US. Well, of course, again, with reference to history, how the Philippines came into American hands, then we've got to understand again the Treaty of Paris. In late 1898, the US signed the Treaty of Paris with Spain and so obtained its first opportunity to govern an Asian society. Whilst in historiographical terms, American colonial authority has been examined with regards to changes in the Philippine economy, politics, law and order, education and public health, far less consideration has been given to city planning, even though it was an elemental component of the early colonial state. The value of urban designing to American colonial rule was evident by as early as 1901, when the US Secretary of War declared that the Senate Park Commission, that is the organization responsible for the Macmillan Plan, should visit the Philippines for the purpose of giving advice to the government as to the treatment of the city of Manila. 4 years later, the place of urban planning within colonial bureaucracy was confirmed, so 1905, when 2 grand city plans were put forward. The most famous city plan, and I should say both plans were composed by Daniel Burnham and P.S. Anderson, The most famous plan was intended to transform Manila into a beautiful modern capital city. The other scheme consisted of the layout of an entirely new city, Baguio, which is in the north of the Philippines. And again, as I'll discuss in this presentation today, the US colonial urban design narrative did not conclude with just these two schemes. Between 1905 and 1916, additional comprehensive urban plans were also tendered. Grand plans were created for Cebu and Zamboanga, and 15 civic centres with reinforced concrete capitol buildings were constructed throughout the country. In fact, such was the volume of urban planning in the Philippines that from 1905 to 1916, the country became, excluding planning activities within the US, the Philippines became the world's greatest testbed for city beautiful urbanism. Now, to come to terms with why America's Colonial Governing Council, the Philippine Commission, instigated such a sizable volume of urban design projects, it's first necessary, I believe, to comprehend the perceptions Americans had of Filipinos and Philippine society. The colonizers' opinion of the 7.6 million people. If you go to the Philippines today, there's a hell of a lot more people than that. So 7.6, very, very low population in comparison today. 7.6 million people who lived in the archipelago by about 1900. What was their opinion? As I've said, the American opinion of these people influenced the nature of colonial rule and the rationale behind the redesign of Philippine cities. As a case in point, Americans observed Filipinos as lacking advanced culture and political experience, as possessing no universal language and living in ways that acted as impediments to interaction between the country's 84 ethnic groups scattered throughout the regions. In light of this assessment, the Americans concluded that neither a national culture nor national sentiment existed, which in itself is an astonishing deduction, given that the first modern nationalist movement against a colonial power in Asia occurred in the Philippines in 1896. Yet, guided by President William McKinley's benevolent assimilation dictum to liberate the local population from their allegedly uncivilized or tribal state of being, to unite them into a single cultural collective, and to convey the role of the US as civilizer of the world, the Philippine Commission sought to fabricate a civil society that would bestow progress and freedoms never before witnessed in the Philippine Islands. Acting as a fatherly friend rather than as an invader or conqueror, the US as a moral duty ventured to uplift, civilize, and Christianize a populace observed as not only different from them, but deficient in relation to the colonizers in terms of their race and civilization. And I should say as well, varying amongst the Filipinos as well, in terms of their race, development, and culture. The Americans claimed that in seeking to impose upon Filipinos modern American customs and mores, they would mold the colonized population into what they termed their little brown brothers. And one settlement, clearly Manila, the capital city, was to play a critical role in this civilization building process. A course of action recognized as ennobling the colonizers as much as it liberate the colonized. In this context, the 1905 plan for Manila was to be an expression of the destiny of the Filipino people, as well as an enduring witness to the efficient services of America in the Philippine Islands. Put briefly, the scheme was to articulate the American imperial mission to reform Philippine civil society. It basically was to help manufacture a modern republican nation state based on an invented ideal type of Filipino citizen. Now, notably, Burnham visited the Philippines from December 1904 to January 1905. This led, by the middle of 1905, to his presentation of the report on proposed improvements of Manila. This was given to the US Secretary of War, at that time William Taft, later became the president. And by 1905, Burnham and Anderson submitted their plan of Baguio. Acting as guides for the future development of the two cities, the reports and the urban plans contained therein illustrated the American desire to transform a society thought of as backward. Significantly too, the design models put forward in the report signalled the end of the Spanish colonial urban design paradigm that was derived from the 1573 decree known as the Law of the Indies by King Philip II. The implementing of plans in Manila and Baguio and subsequent schemes elsewhere rendered the spatial model derived from the Law of the Indies as redundant. With Burnham, and also then the man who brought these plans into being, a man called William Parsons, who I'll talk about later. So with Burnham and Parsons' importation of the City Beautiful model of urban design into the Philippines, urban places became organised for the first time along lines other than grid plans, with a centrally placed church and space, known as in Spanish the Plaza Mayor. But again, to ensure that the local population would understand this restructuring of Manila and the construction of Baguio in the way that the Philippine Commission intended, the projects as expressions of colonial authority had to merge into the existing local governmental context. But in actuality, at the same time, the Americans coveted the fact that their governmental policies were explicitly different from Spanish colonial procedures in order to demonstrate that American governance would not be corrupt nor oppressive. In light of this, American rule, that is, the uplifting of the Philippines, had an intrinsic paradox. On one hand, it revealed itself to be gradualistic in that it would sanction certain elements from pre-1898 society to be maintained. On the other hand, it was to be paradigmatic because it possessed dissimilarities from what existed during the Spanish colonial era. And if we reference Foucault for a minute, Michel Foucault suggests that when public authorities initiate modernity that is paradigmatic, in other words, different from what existed before, people can sense a chronological discontinuity. And for the Americans, the need to demonstrate the contrasting political and cultural nature of the Philippines was weighty. As self-proclaimed civilizers of the world, they inspired to inform the Filipinos that their country's evolution was being redirected as a result of benevolent assimilation. But inheriting insanitary urban environments, outdated and corrupt administrative machinery, and finding disquiet amongst the local population with regards to the application of law and order, the Philippine Commission initially had few precedents on which to base its policies, so that, as promised, societal development, advanced culture, and education in self-government could transpire. As an illustration of the Philippine Commission's use of urban planning to cultivate higher civilization, the 1905 plan for Manila was intended to expand the local economy, elevate levels of security and convenience, and provide the Philippine capital city with a fresh visual and spatial character. This makeover, a demonstration of the active power of the US within a society that was allegedly held down by the degenerate influence of Spain, envisaged the modern American city within Asia so that Filipinos could detect the superior nature of their country compared with what had existed before or with other cities in the Southeast Asian region. With its new roads, buildings and urban spaces, some of which were to be highly symbolic, Manila after 1905 was to become visually impressive. This is what Daniel Dopers describes as the brand signature of the US imperial presence in Asia. So what was the 1905 plan consisting of? Well, it consisted of a number of basic architectural and spatial components. The transformation of the city into a model colonial outpost was to be attained through the creation of public parks, the abundant planting of foliage throughout the settlement, the laying down of new streets, the development of the seafront, and of course the construction of new public buildings. These changes ultimately, or collectively, aim to promote a secular civic vision and at the same time undermine Catholic spatial logic that would augment the settlement's economy, as I've said, boost the level of culture and elevate the local quality of life. Manila's controlled expansion would facilitate population growth from about 225,000 people in 1905 to a maximum level of about 2 million people in the future. A primary element of the 1905 plan was the relocation of the governmental core outside of the Spanish walled city known as Intramuros and placing it into the Extramuros, outside the walls, which is what it literally translates to. And again, this was very, very symbolic, a great symbolic meaning, because the Intramuros, the walled city, had been the spatial embodiment of Spanish colonization and military might. And it demonstrated by taking government out of it that the Intramuros area, this walled city, was no longer the cultural and governmental nucleus of the Philippines. Burnham and Anderson, through their city plan, promoted the new colonial government's accessibility to the Filipino population via the transformed urban form and in particular the arrangement of roads. The road system was inspired by Washington, D.C., which was said by Daniel Burnham to be the best planned of all modern cities. And again, what was happening was there was Manila would be formed with a grid, but punctuated by radial boulevards and diagonal arteries. These arteries were to be tree-lined thoroughfares laid down to connect the new civic core in the Extramuros to the outlying suburban communities. Along these roadways, monumental vistas to and from new governmental buildings were to be formed. Grand views were also to be established for other new prominent public edifices, such as the central train station. And significantly, the existing rail system for the first time was to be expanded to connect to the port. With the enlarged harbour facilities and new wharfs along the Pasig River, the handling of freight was to be made much more convenient for local businesses. In the words of Burnham and Anderson, the improvement of freight handling was to contribute greatly to the prosperity of the city. Okay. Just briefly before I move on, in terms of, maybe if I go back, again, the new governmental district was to be known as the government group, and again was designed as a symmetrical built mass with two main spaces. You can see one here and one here. Central building, this is the capital, was to be located here. To the east, you have this semicircular space with a monument from which, again, roads would disappear towards the urban fringe. And then you have this green space, this Washington DCS Mall. If you go to Manila today, you'll know this by the name of Rizal Park. And that was to provide a spectacular view towards Manila Bay, which we can see just at the bottom of the picture. But in City Beautiful Manila, people's capacity to see these buildings, see the new government buildings through urban spaces and along new streets was meaningful. Vistas were to permit the public to look with esteem towards the insignia of American colonial government. That's the dome, in particular on the Capitol building. And likewise, it was to enable the nation's bureaucrats to look out to the city and the people over whom they were to serve. Such a ploy was designed to provoke a number of transitions associated with the uplifting and civilizing of local society. Yet to comprehend how the raising of civilization was to transpire, it's necessary to appreciate, if only briefly, the structure of colonial government and how it would operate. Because the nature of the political system established by the Americans was founded on a patron-client alliance between the colonizers and the Filipino elites. And this alliance was to function at a number of different levels. At the national level, by Filipino provincial leaders and national politicians interacting with Americans. In the regions, via didactic relations between local and provincial leaders and national level Filipino politicians, and then at the municipal level by local and provincial Filipino leaders interacting with rural and urban residents. So in a sense, what the Americans did was create a system that tied local government offices to regional and national government departments. Bureaus before 1898 exclusively reserved only for the Spanish. But in a sense, what the Americans did by tying the local to the regional to the national was provide ambitious Filipino politicians with a conduit to work up the ladder. And by networking and by practicing democratic political principles, Filipinos would be able to work up the system. At the same time, this system was very handy for the Americans because it allowed them to exploit public offices as venues in which Filipinos could be socialized in political responsibilities. In other words, it granted the Americans a means to school the Filipinos in subjects which they had not been formally trained in before. In view of this development, government officers would temper any potential capricious or authoritarian behavior that could be exhibited by Filipinos in civic affairs. But again, crucially, the Americans maintained the pre-1898 social hierarchy so that the practical political education system could occur. Because without the patronage of influential local chiefs and the ilustrados, this is the rising urban middle class, educated middle class, and ilustrados basically translates as enlightened or learned ones. Any attempts the Americans would make to reform Philippine society would be at best subject to impediments, or worse, risk of failure. As powerful families controlled districts, even provinces in some cases, American colonization could not survive without the resources and backing of Filipino elites. So by necessity, colonial government was formed to satisfy the opinions and aspirations of this important social group. By instituting the Filipinization of the civil service, the Americans, in the context of their temporary rule in the Philippines, cemented the Philippine upper class to the nation's evolution as it headed towards independence. New loyalties among Filipinos emerged out of a concerted campaign to wean the population away from Spanish cultural and political mores, a process that incorporated making Jose Rizal a national hero. And therefore, nationhood was able to develop, and urban designing, as I'll explain, was not ignorant to this process. Because the 1905 Manila Plan, as I've already touched upon, was designed to pronounce that a new era had begun in the Philippines. Whereas the Intramuros, with its grand fortifications and plazas with churches, houses of the nobles, government buildings, and the homes of the mercantile classes, had dominated Manila's cityscape until then, the reconfigured built fabric was to proclaim the arrival of the modern age. As an articulation of the nation's progress after 1898, City Beautiful Manila was to underscore to Filipinos a distinction between Spanish Philippines and American Philippines. Because as far as the Americans were concerned, Spanish colonial rule in its quest for God, glory, and gold had done nothing more than produce a civilization disparate from that founded on the principles of the Enlightenment. In other words, the American society. Exposing the self-proclaimed superiority of the Anglo-Saxon / Protestant race to Spanish and, of course, local indigenous races. The Americans believed that the importation of the modern city to the Philippines would help remove shackles that had suppressed the local population. It would provide social and economic opportunities not previously possible before 1898, and by doing so empower Filipinos to reveal their true spirit. As I've said, Burnham was helping forge a new society. But again, in this context, the construction of vistas were an important element of Manila's built fabric from 1905. Because the restructured city was to allow all social and racial groups to individually and collectively observe public institutions operating on their behalf. And therefore it encouraged people by means of sight to merge into a single cohesive community. In abstract terms, and this is something Dennis Cosgrove talks about, the tactic of establishing views towards particular urban features permits citizens to see and therefore own what they see. In addition, it emphasizes the fact that what you see is a reality belonging to the now. And again, for the Americans, vistas towards new public buildings and spaces helped enforce the point that history, that is the narrative of Philippine society up to 1898, had truly been arrested. Whereas too, before 1898, racial groups were intentionally kept apart, often had disdain towards each other, and government institutions were hidden inside the walls of the Intramuros. After 1905, new roads and urban spaces, such as public parks and monuments, will enable all people to see public offices, to observe new civic rituals, and to freely intermingle as citizens of a new kind of nation. Parks and shaded walkways were useful in this regard as they provided settings for people to saunter and mix. For instance, places such as you've got the parks here. This is Harrison Park. This was the former moat of the walled city, which the Americans filled in on public health grounds, but they greened it. You've got Rizal Park just there. And of course, then there's the greening of certain roads in the new city. So again, parks and shaded walkways, as I've said, were useful as they provided new settings for people to just walk, enjoy new leisure activities, and to mix together. And again, often, such as with respect to developing the Intramuros moat, filling it in, this was rationalized by the Americans on public health grounds. But it was one that conveniently abetted their strategy to diminish built vestiges of Spanish logics of colonialism. All American public planning initiatives, such as the development of an English language education system, the beginning of sanctioning political campaigning, and instituting public health programs and hospitals, were all designed to fulfill the strategic aim of consolidating the union of Filipinos, and of course inventing the collective subject Filipino, by removing perceived social barriers that dated back to the Spanish colonial era. The Americans hoped this change would help convince Filipinos to consider themselves universally for the first time as one people. Again, to promote the uniting of Filipinos, the role of green spaces, I think, acquires acknowledgement. While it may be noted that the merging of buildings with landscape spaces was to assist Manila in being visually equal to the greatest cities of the Western world, green spaces had much more use than just mere beautification. In the case of Manila's mall, its central axis directly corresponded to the Isla del Corregidor, that's the island right at the mouth of Manila Bay, over 40 kilometers away. Notably, too, to foster awareness of the Philippine nation, a monument dedicated to Jose Rizal marks this particular alignment, and I'll talk about the alignment a little bit more in a moment. Consequently, through Burnham's placing of Manila's version of the Washington Monument, that's the monument of Washington DC, within the Philippine capital's new primary urban space, the open area became interlinked with Filipinism, namely the notion of amalgamating the greatest in the Orient with the greatest in the Latin and the Anglo-Saxon worlds. And I should say, if you've got any questions about this, I'll be happy to talk about this later, because I'm actually part of the, I've been part of the law case at the Supreme Court to get this building removed. So I'd be happy to explain what's happening, because the result of this should be coming out in about the next 2 weeks, I believe. The Philippine writer, historian Renato Constantino stated that the Philippine Commission, that's the American colonial government in the Philippines, strove to identify and honor a Philippine hero for the purpose of channeling local anger against Spain, blunting animosity towards the Americans and encouraging unity among the people. Selecting Rizal as that hero and then erecting a monument to him within the mall, the Philippine Commission fashioned a rallying point for Filipinos. Such an action had 3 impacts. It bestowed prestige on Rizal as father of the Filipinos. It raised the esteem of the Ilustrados, and obviously the social class to which he belonged, and it upheld Rizal's perspective that Filipinos belonged to a single political ethno-collective. To enhance this, to build this, the Philippine Commission passed laws, as I've said, to consolidate, indeed validate, the sentiment of belonging to the Philippine nation. Act 345, for example, ensured the anniversary of Rizal's death, the 30th of December, would be a day of national observance. Additionally, so that ceremonies would take place in other parts of the country, the Bureau of Public Works erected statues of Rizal within new urban spaces sited in proximity to new government buildings. Urban design as such was not inert to the colonial government procedure of creating, officializing, and propagating national Philippine culture and identity, but rather was central to the development of the Philippine nation as an artifact of American modernism, that is, understood as a benign and paternal exercise in Republican imperialism. As I've said, this is the grand axis I mentioned a moment or so ago, to further illustrate the assembly of Philippine identity by means of city planning. Post-1905, as visitors approached Manila by boat, to be exact, they would be on a direct alignment from the Iladao Corregidor to the new central pier, and therefore their eyes would be magnetized towards the Capitol, the mall, and the memorial to Rizal. Whereas one visitor to Manila before the implementation of the 1905 city plan had observed that when viewed from distance, the settlement lay almost at water level, with the exception of the churches and bell towers in the intramuros. After 1905, the cityscape disclosed a divergent appearance due to what would intended to be the dominating presence of the capital's dome. Trees planted in proximity to the shoreline were to play a valuable role in enhancing this new city image. Whilst trees would provide shade along the widened road known as the Ocean Boulevard, today Rosas Boulevard, when viewed from Manila Bay, they would help diminish the visual hegemony of the Intramuros' churches and Fort Santiago by steering visitors' eyes towards the only open area in the city centre. That is to say, the mall and the pier at its front, Rizal Park as it is today. But of course you don't get that effect today because there's now a hotel built right in front of the space. Serving as the entrance to the city and country at large, the pier with the Rizal Monument, Capitol and urban spaces directly to its rear, therefore was intended to present an impressive image of Manila to persons disembarking, a vista compromising both an American imperial and native disposition. The assimilation of American civilization with Philippine nationhood in Manila's urban form was not restricted to just the waterfront or the mall, Rizal Park, as it is today. It was to be apparent too in the vistas created along Manila's diagonal arteries. People, as they looked from the suburbs along the boulevards to the government group, could see a monument dedicated to the Philippines and its people. In this framework, vistas helped the public to grasp that a constructive partnership between the Americans and Filipinos was in operation, one in which Filipinism was not only accepted, but in fact encouraged. As the Philippine writer Razil Mojares has suggested, the assemblage of national culture served an important purpose for both Filipinos and Americans. For the Filipinos, he claims, it aided their cohesion at a time when they were finding their place within the modern world for the first time. However, the execution of the new urban design paradigm was not without its critics. Many local newspapers professed that the cost of reshaping Manila could have been spent in better ways. Newspapers such as La Vanguardia, for instance, declared, "Embellish the city, but not at the cost of the health and lives of the great part of the population." Other newspapers, El Ideal, remarked, "What use is it to beautify part of the city if not the health and sanitary conditions of the most populous sector, if not the most populous sections are attended to. Other newspapers, for instance, said things such as, let necessary and urgent things be done before superfluous things. And it is urgent to improve the very populous working men's barrios first. Now, with respect to the second urban plan that I mentioned, Baguio, I'm not sure if you've been to Baguio, but if you have, it's about 6 hours by bus from Manila. It's quite an interesting bus ride. And it's a city that's located about 5,000 feet above sea level. It's much cooler, different climate. It was designed originally for 25,000 people. It today has about 350,000 people. But it was a city that was designed from the outset, where roads, spaces, buildings would merge with the natural surroundings. And again, it was a city that very quickly garnered a reputation for possessing a park-like beauty, and it's still a reputation that exists today. The Philippine magazine, for instance, in 1931 stated, Baguio illustrates the value of city planning. Yet to comprehend Baguio's plan, it's imperative to understand why the landscape is much more than just a backdrop for the city. It's vital to appreciate why Burnham and Anderson blended the Philippine landscape into the urban plan. By venturing to grasp the amalgam of the natural landscape with city beautiful urbanism, I think what it's important to understand is that Baguio was a place that enabled the Americans to acquire control over what had previously been barren, wild, disease-ridden terrain, and therefore as well to school and bring together uncivilized, heterogeneous people into an urban environment which was designed right from the outset to be of unquestionable beauty. A number of factors influenced the nature of Baguio's urban design. The configuration of streets aligned to a grid aligned northwest to southeast / northeast to southwest, so that the buildings' elevations could receive sunlight at different times of the day. That was good for public health. And again, the city was designed in order to pull in people previously beyond the margins of civilized society in the mountain region of North Luzon. In trying to normalize people living previously beyond the parameters of advanced civilization, city planning in this framework acted as a social instrument to confront and then resolve existing social and environmental predicaments. As a late 1800s / early 1900s response to what Paul Rabineau has described or called the modern age's recasting of the relationship between the individual, state, society, and space, city planning therefore is recognized first by reformers and then by governments as a tool to impart good environmental and social standards so that cities, be they in Europe, North America, and Asia, could be labelled as civilized. In implementing the grid in Baguio, Burnham used architectural rationalization as well as social reasoning. Referring to cities established on hilly terrains in France, Italy, Japan, and the US, Burnham explained that straight roads on inclines granted unique visual possibilities. Hilltops, given their topographical distinction, he said, offered unique sites for buildings of special interest and allowed vistas to be created to and from these buildings. And again, he cited the Capitol building as a model, with Pennsylvania Avenue, Maryland Avenue, the Mall, all creating views to the Capitol building, which sits on an elevated site within Washington, D.C. A key constituent of Baguio's plan was the utilization of local plantings and topography. Because it was situated in a mountain region and on ground of undulating character, Baguio's site created urban planning challenges not encountered in either Manila or City Beautiful projects in the US. Yet Burnham comprehended the hilly land nonetheless as offering particular planning advantages, such as being able to provide opportunities for buildings constructed on the top of hills in order to command views down the streets in proximity to them. But then again, in Baguio, the built environment was formed not only to utilize the natural surroundings, but again to do so in a manner that enabled the city plan to blend with the natural landscape. Here Burnham reflected the influence of his colleague, the landscape designer Law Olmsted Jr., who in turn represented an American appropriation of the 18th century English landscape gardens, and in a sense was anticipating the rise of the garden city movement in Britain and in Europe. The central core, for instance, comprises of two parts, a municipal centre and government centre, national government buildings, that are located at opposite ends of a valley. And this is the thing about Baguio, it's very much a three-dimensional experience. I did a PhD in the School of Architecture, and one of the things that's emphasised to you is you should visit sites. this really is a classic example of the need to go, because until you can look at it in a book and it's flat, it's two-dimensional, the plan, but when you actually go and see how it sits, it's a very, very different experience. So the valley is about 1.2 kilometers long and about 800 meters wide, and today there is a lake that they've built in it, known as Burnham Lake. And this grand axis between the two sets of government buildings basically is the anchor from which the rest of the city plan is arranged. David Brody, his book Visualizing American Empire, reasoned that the plan of Baguio granted the Americans a scopic capacity to see and therefore control the city. In offering a paradigm of disciplinary sight, he argues, Baguio was an example of design and power interacting to affect people's, namely the Filipinos' behavior. Brody Brody established a comparison between the city's spatial arrangement and the panopticon, which is the institutional building Foucault used to explain that design could be an agent of authority / control. And therefore he was essentially pronouncing that the visibility of public buildings in Baguio were expressive of the American colonial desire to control and reshape Filipinos. So again, in Brody's view, the city plan was formed with grand axes so that unobstructed views of public buildings and in turn unhindered visual pathways to power could be formed. Baguio's primary leisure space, an esplanade, a park at the centre, again was positioned directly on the axis between the municipal and government centre, and therefore acted in his view as a contact zone. A contact zone to enable people historically, geographically and culturally separated from each other to come into contact so that the dominant group, that is the Americans, could coerce the weaker group, the Filipinos, partly to facilitate colonial authority. But the plan for Baguio was about, as I've said, conversion of a wild upland locale into a beautiful organised urban environment, with the removal of the wilderness, in a sense, being central to the instigation of paradigmatic modernity. The Americans transformed the local elites in this spatial, cultural and political context into adjuncts of their colonial role. Such a grasp of Baguio, however, ignores one important fact. The Americans in Baguio, like in other urban places that were altered due to the practice of urban planning, permitted local people to use urban space so as to form their own harmonious civic body. By way of illustration, Baguio's esplanade, which is today known as Burnham Park, was a site of different leisure activities and encouraged not only Americans and Filipino elites to fraternize, but also different Philippine social classes and ethnic groups to come together. By sharing this space, Filipinos would not only have a mutual place of enjoyment and a site to recognize the beauty of their city, but an environment too to also come together and to share experiences about where they lived. To really kind of move towards the final part of my talk today, I hope I'm okay for time, or maybe I run through this quite quickly. From 1905 to 1916, there was a large number of urban planning schemes that were taking place, other than just Manila and Baguio. And again, this was about, as I've said, this proliferation of Philippine national culture and the cultivation of civic liberalism in the regions. And I talk about this really as an outcome of political cooperation between the American and local populations. Just to really move through this quite quickly, the man who was really important to this, and in a sense the man who built the Baguio and Manila plans by Burnham, was a man who's very, very rarely written about. There's very, very little historiography of this man. William E. Parsons, he was the first consultant architect. And again, he was a Beaux-Arts educated architect. He was chosen by Burnham because he was seen as understand the original schemes and therefore would be faithful in implementing them. But he was a man who was responsible for composing new city plans and planning civic centres in numerous provincial cities. In other words, he helped propagate Burnham's City Beautiful model throughout the Philippines. And again, his work ensured that the church-lined plazas ceased to be the primary focal public space in Philippine cities. Instead, the principal open area was to be a symmetrically formed landscape plaza situated in front of a classically designed capitol building or municipal office. And again, implementing green urban space was very important to this particular architect because he said it was about making sure public buildings were in positions of dignity and retirement. As I've said, Parsons and his planning officials instituted a visual and spatial transformation of numerous provincial settlements. Probably the greatest example of his work is in Lingayen, where there was a new civic centre established on a 25-hectare site. So very big project, with a capitol building, which you can see here, plaza, which is now used as a public park, monuments, schools, playgrounds, courthouse, prisons, storehouses, residence for the provincial governor, provincial treasurer. It radically transformed the nature of the settlement. And again, just to be really, I think I have some animation here. Essentially, again, what the scheme was doing was moving the city away from the Spanish-era plaza. So in a sense, he's not only introducing a new morphology, but he's really taking the city out from the Spanish-built environment. And of course, this was to be a visually different environment because it was green public space and also an aesthetic of classical design, but importantly, built from concrete rather than the Spanish preference for stone. So there's very much a structural change that is taking place within the Philippine city. 1912, from 1912 to 1916, he was responsible for two major city plans. Again, because of time, I'll run through these quite quickly. Here they are. And again, use of demonstrating American colonial power with the idea that colonial power could be wielded for public good, and as I've said, articulated through new spatial forms. And again, the representation of this modernization, the transition of society. Just again, to be very, very quick, with respect to these particular schemes. These schemes which involved creating new public spaces and ensuring that new civic buildings were highly visible within the idea of the modern Philippine city was again about trying to enact a meta-culture, this meta-culture of modernization that would sit above what to the Americans was the allegedly low regional culture. And again, it was about eradicating certain traditions, taking a very different approach to what the Spanish had done before. And again, trying to enable Filipinos to embrace a new level of civilization. This was, again, very clear from the idea of benevolent assimilation. So in the light of the American perception that Filipinos possess cultural shortcomings, environmental transformation was one means among many. And I think this is important. It's not just working on its own. It has to be seen with public health, with education, with these other fundamentals, economic development. It's one means of many, given American colonial government logic to help fortify Filipinos' evolution from the primitive to advanced. With regards again to the urban environment, this process was to be manifest in the construction of new buildings and spaces that use materials, technology and planning notions born from the US. Just again to quickly run through this because of time. This is Zamboanga, which is in the far southeast of Mindanao, which is in a Muslim area. Again, the city would be divided into blocks. You can see it along the seafront here. This was on reclaimed land. The idea was to make a large connection between the new government centre here and previously the icon of Spanish power, which, like in Manila, was to now be turned into basically a walking site. So to diminish its role within, make it a leisure facility, so to speak, now, rather than an icon of authority. The city would be filled with trees. Again, tree-lined boulevards were to draw attention. You can see the tree-lined boulevards were to draw attention to the new Capitol building. And again, this visual linking between the fort and the new Capitol, again, linked together in two of the most important pieces of architecture in Zamboanga's political history. Once again, briefly, building design was to be radically changed. Whereas nipper huts were the predominant form of architecture, Parsons' scheme proposed new buildings of what he described proper construction and character. And again, these buildings were to be designed in the same aesthetic, the classical aesthetic, so as to harmonise with each other and to give the city an imposing and quite unique appearance. The civic centre, as the most important feature in the renewed urban core, was to have its own urban spaces. One space was to be sited between the civic core and the shoreline, and was to have its centre point marked by a statue. And again, why was the space to be here? Because this was a shipping lane. So the idea was, again, as boats went by, they would see the transition that was taking place. And importantly, the space near the shoreline would allow the Capitol building to be very easily seen. But as I've said, it's important to put this scheme into the context of the problem of Muslim integration, which had been a historical problem for the Spanish. So in a sense, again, city planning was used, you could say, in this context, to test the capacity of American civil rule, colonial rule, to civilize and unify culturally plural subjects. And again, what is important was, given the nature of local culture, one that the Americans had seen as savage and backward, it's important to appreciate how the Americans envisaged integrating the Moros, as they called them, the Muslims, into a national society framework. And again, Moro backwardness was seen by the Americans to not only be an upshot of cultural matters, but was to be an effect, too, of their ignorance as to the abundant possibilities of modernity. So in other words, again, what the Americans are simply trying to do here is create a new city, but by developing this new environment, create a new economy. And the development of the economy would allow people to, in theory, earn previously unimaginable amounts of money. And in this setting, the Americans thought that the Protestant, Anglo-Saxon, work ethic of time and discipline would aid and uplift and civilize this Muslim population. And I think, again, what's important here is that in Western thinking, broadly, capital creation was understood as possessing an ability to unite people. So in this conceptual framework, once capitalism encounters a pre-modern or uncivilized society, there's a kind of struggle that ensues. And in this course of which capital cancels out or neutralizes the contingent differences between specific histories. So in this way, capitalism eradicates archaic and inefficient elements within society, replacing them with a new ethic, upward mobility and advancement as part of the commencement of modernity. And again, just to be very brief, this idea of taking modernity out was reflected in the building of civic centres, sometimes very large scale. This was a scheme of more than 400 metres of length, 400 metres of breadth, in a relatively small settlement of about 10 to 15,000 people. And as I've said, these new civic centres were about new public buildings, plazas, public spaces, and in this case in Cabanatuan, also about sports facilities as well. Again, take it just briefly before I come to the conclusion. The idea, again, well-kept lawns, trees, plants. These were to set an example that would then aid the beautification of the rest of the streets and spaces that existed within a municipality. So the concept of surrounding public buildings with substantially sized large-scale spaces was fundamental in the planning of these municipal complexes. And again, William Parsons was very much the man who was involved in this. And of course, just to really, as a final comment with respect to architecture, as I've said, the key building material of the Spanish colonial age was stone, whereas the Americans introduced concrete, which of course symbolically is a quintessential modern age building material. But the treatment of concrete was very much in keeping with contemporary fashion. So elevation design was handled strictly in accordance with classical notions of proportion, and detailing on elevations was to be simple rather than fussy. That's partly out of fashion, but also partly out of money. I should emphasize that there's an economic difference. But as an upshot of this architectural approach, the elevations of public buildings in the Philippines were to present an interplay of solid, that is the wall structure, with void, such as window openings and recessed entrances. And again, this was very much the fashion in early 1900s America and places like Britain as well. So just let's bring it to a close then. So the period 1898 to 1916, I argue, or I believe, is a very significant era in terms of urban design in the Philippines. And during this era, Daniel Burnham composed the first public reports ever dedicated to the planning of Philippine settlements. So my talk, I hope, has emphasized how the modernization of Philippine society after 1898 transpired as a result of the importation of American culture and politics into the east of Asia and the Philippine archipelago. And again, in shifting the nature of life away from what it had been before 1898, American colonial governance had been highly interventionist in character. By the early 1900s, it had yielded a revolution in the design and planning of Philippine cities. thanks to the rise of city beautiful urbanism in North America in the 1890s, the Philippine Commission was able to espouse a design type that it believed would enhance the physical and social condition of society. Because it was believed to elevate public loyalty to the Americans, in other words, patriotism is openly fostered by art, ceremony, ideal, and symbol. That's the logic. The refashioning of urban space as part of the American attempt to uplift and civilize Filipinos was ultimately so considerable that, to quote Thomas Hines, who's written a lot about the City Beautiful, he says that the City Beautiful movement attained its greatest success not on American but on foreign colonial soil. Just again to bring things to a close, I hope that I've been able to explain, if briefly, the contribution of American design towards this notion of invention and assembly of Philippine national character and national culture. However, there's a need for much more research on this. The role of Philippine architects within colonial bureaucracy needs to be much more fully explored. There's very, very little research on that. In the case of Philippine designers, their activities within the institutional framework of the Bureau of Public Works enabled them to receive City Beautiful urban design experience directly. Also, with many Philippine architects also being recipients of the Pensionados program, which was a scholarship introduced in 1903 to offer higher level education in the US, and then upon their return to Asia, a position in the colonial civil service. These individuals were able to progress from the status of what the Spanish called master builders into really bona fide modern architects and city planners. And again, such advancement was not only about increased technical competence, but social acceptance as well. Significantly too, after when William Parsons left the Philippines in 1914, there's the Philippinization of the colonial government, particularly from 1916. And as such, US-educated Filipinos such as Juan Arellano and Antonio Toledo steered the course of modern Philippine urbanism through holding the renowned consultant architect position within the Bureau of Public Works. And their appropriation of neoclassical urbanism, which had been imported by Burnham in the Philippines in 1905 and then propagated in the years after by Parsons, was not only monumental in terms of design projects that these Filipinos created, but crucially was about forging cityscapes where people in the run-up to independence came to belong and feel a sense of country with nuances of patriotism. The experiments in civic republic modernist planning of the City Beautiful in the colonies was not about one-way cultural traffic, because it actually flowed back to the metropole. Following his plans for Manila and Baguio, Daniel Burnham composed a grand plan for San Francisco, a scheme he delivered to City Hall a day prior to the devastating April 1906 earthquake, which put an end to that. And of course Chicago in 1909. But San Francisco and Chicago, with their geometrically arranged civic centres, tree-lined boulevards and landscape spaces, these two civic city projects bore the imprint of Burnham's work in the Philippine capital and in Baguio. However, this similarity is much more than superficial. With their highly ordered urban forms, all four plans, San Francisco, Chicago, Baguio, Manila, demonstrated how City Beautiful urbanism was founded upon the establishing of a spatial order that was subordinate to a dignified whole, a totality that would centre itself literally and figuratively upon the most important public building in each settlement. That is to say, the Capitol building or the City Hall. And all four plans emphasised how spatial organisation, aesthetics, environmental behaviourism, and civic politics were entwined with modern American grand city planning. So to bring it all to an end, therefore the image of the modern American city was defined by spatial regulation and grand vistas established by the urban planner. In other words, who was the keystone in the modern environmental arch, so to speak. And the keystone in the modern environmental arch, so to speak, was the dome, the vertical element of the dome, which would be seen along certain grand vistas. And indicative of the presence of modern civilization, the marrying of urban design with societal upgrading basically enabled urban planners, and so their plans, to take on a kind of heroic status. As a method to activate public betterment, Burnham's dictum of making no little plans because they have no magic to stir men's blood was much more than mere rhetoric. It was a call by a planner to other designers to engage in public service. In this milieu, if those in positions of authority in the US or in the Philippines desired to forge an uplifted world and all that it broadly entailed, then the urban plan was one means of getting there. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ian, for that wide-ranging talk that brings in so many elements of of the colonial era. We have about a half an hour for discussion. At the risk of abusing power, I'll start out. I found it very interesting, your argument about modernity and the Americans keen to distinguish themselves from the Spanish. And it is a fascinating example of this dual colonial experience in the Philippines. Quite unusual to have two colonial masters and the architectural difference. However, I think one of the keys to the, quote, success of this was the Americans' ability to instrumentalize Rizal. And of course, Rizal Park is crucial, but you also mentioned Rizal as the national hero, and in the middle of this, the equivalent of the mall in Washington is the statue of Rizal. And of course, people like Constantino would criticize that, but Rizal had genuine support in the Philippines. When the Katipunan organized its revolution, they approached Rizal. So it's not like an artificial figure.
No.
And this is also symbolic for the fact that the Americans were very successful, as you mentioned, in courting the elites, because they were in a sense giving the elites who were opposing the Spanish what they wanted, it seemed. Of course, later criticized for subverting popular will that was coming out through the revolution. So I guess my quibble is that, and then if you think about things like Blair and Robertson, the Americans' effort to really understand the Spanish period, 70 odd volumes that they translated. So they're fascinated by they really wanted to know the Spanish past. They took Jose Rizal, and in a sense they were developing his secular vision for the Philippines, this anti-clerical writings. And I think this is one reason why for most Filipinos, if I can make this generalization, there isn't this sharp break in their mind. There is Intramuros, but there are these buildings, and there's not a sense of discontinuity.
No.
I think it's, your argument is, point is taken, but one reason why there was quibbles in the press about the expenses and so on, but as you say, Filipino architects, when they continued this project later, they continued in this plan because it did seem to enjoy widespread acceptance, at least at the elite level.
Well, I think again the thing with there's the idea of what the city plan is to do, and then clearly there's always the issue with the city plan as to how it gets enacted. And what the Americans were very clear were, we need plans. We know that there's, and Burnham came over for free. But then there's the problem of enacting it. And they are quite clear when you look through the commission reports and things that there's not the money to do it. So it's going to be stage by stage, and clearly certain elements of the scheme were of far less significance than other components of the scheme. So there was things that were enacted, but as you say, the sense of discontinuity was partly because even by the 1930s, 1940s in some cases, they're still trying to build some of the buildings. So that sense of immediate transition environmentally doesn't occur, as much as Burnham is putting forward this notion that it can. As you say, there's the pragmatics and partly money, partly because the Philippine elites refused to make their land available for development, and hence by the 1930s you end up with the rise of zoning planning.
Right, but I suppose the point I'm trying to make is because Rizal, in Manila is literally the center of things.
Yes, yeah.
This is one reason why this American colonial project is not delegitimized by the outside power coming. They're clever enough to utilize Rizal.
Yeah.
And in a sense, more generally, his sort of secular vision of the state over the church.
Yes.
That's the point I was trying to make.
Yes.
That's one reason why this incredible project finds relatively widespread acceptance, at least by elites, is my sense.
Yeah. Well, by some, but as I said, by the let's call them the landed elites in and around Manila, there was a great kind of rejection. Because in two ways, and that's why again the zoning plans were important, because it would allow, by the 1920s and 30s, there's the rise of slums.
Yeah.
And that takes on a different issue. Again, issues of public health, but there's then issues of let's call them industrial workshops, not quite factories, but industrial units occurring within these housing areas, very much like what happened in 19th century Britain. And then on the other hand, you have landowners who were very worried that as the city would kind of spill out, then their land would decrease in value. So the zoning plan was a way of actually saying, look, in some areas we'll call it residential group A, residential group B, and in group A we'll basically design it for working class people, and in the other districts will ensure that they're very salubrious and high quality. And again, this city plan was much more embraced as part of the city efficient movement, which was a different form of American governance that emerges in the 1900s. But I think you're exactly right. I think that, part of the problem as well was, as you say, there's this great need for knowledge when the Americans get to the Philippines, because they know so little about Filipinos. One of the early Philippine commissioners was an ethnographer, Dean Worcester, and his photo collections are again very well documented, because there was a need, because they just didn't know anything. And of course, and then if we're looking at, say, American-Spanish relations, it's clearly painted by what had gone off in 1840s or 50s with Mexico. So there was again a great need for the Americans to actually find out what was going off. And as you say, law was very important. They create thousands and thousands of laws within the first 4 or 5 years. And as you say, they're very quick to pick up on the value of Rizal in promoting this civic vision. But I think, again, it has to be seen this kind of propaganda, that ultimately urban planning is propaganda. It's creating an image of what society would...
I guess my question is why it was so successful as propaganda. And Rizal strikes me as the key to the riddle.
But again, because it was made in law quite early on, that there would be money available to develop a statue to him, and then they would make a space available to him, or what was called the luneta. Then there'd be money available to build a monument to him, which is what it is today, which essentially is his grave, because his bones are underneath it. And then again, that would then be there was money available to then copy and take it out. And again, this was continuing all the way through the 1920s and the 1930s. Through the 1920s, for instance, there's in Bicol, the south of Luzon Island, there's statues being put up to martyrs that were killed by the Spanish in the Katipunan, the 15 martyrs of Bicol, which were again put in front of new municipal buildings. So even the kind of Spanish plazas were being reinvigorated by the 1920s, but now importantly by Filipinos. And these were Filipinos like Ariano and Toledo, and I've interviewed their sons, and the one thing they're very strong about is their father's sense of pride in country. They're nationalists, in other words. So again, it takes on a slightly different agenda, but I think, as you say, that there's clearly a very significant political advantage that the Americans gain through this awareness quickly of the cult of Rizal, so to speak.
Thank you.
So this is a great topic. This is, again, nothing I have no knowledge of anything related to this. So, but your talk left me with it's okay. Left me with a
hot seat.
No, I'm just joking. Left me with an impression that Burnham, architects like Burnham, they were to enhance the condition of the Philippine society. But with the case of Baguio, there was the scholar Brody. You said you saw some Foucauldian dynamics at play with the panopticon, and I don't see that. And it just based on your talk that you gave right now, where do you see those dynamics in play, or do you take that negative approach to it, that pessimistic approach?
Well, I think he's picking up it's colonial power. Colonial power, whatever way you wrap it up, whether it's meant to be benevolent or not, ultimately isn't. There's an element in it that can be cruel, and clearly power is an important articulation of that. So I can see where he picks that up. There's a new book that's just come out called American Imperial Pastoral, which is about Baguio and the development of the economy there. And I think there's all these kind of arguments. This latest book is really very ethnographic. That there's an element of truism in all of them, and I think that's it. There's kind of components, these various components kind of enmesh, but can be read in different ways, because I mean, at the end of the day, what Burnham was doing was basically Baroque urbanism, and Baroque urbanism is about power. That's the root of it. Well, if you take the European, or particularly French, I mean, it's about absolutism. Now, I'm not saying that Baguio was about absolutism, because again, American city planning is really about creating spaces and buildings and vistas where people can see democratic government. The idea is that you see democratic institutions. But yeah, I think there's clearly an issue of authority to it. I just sometimes think I've been to Baguio a number of times, and I can understand David Brody's argument, but I don't think Burnham was that specific in it. And I think again, it depends on how you read history. You can pick up particular sources and you can kind of run with them and make certain things of it. And again, I'm not to be critical of David Brody because it's an interesting book, but I think it's more kind of balanced between the issues of building beautiful cities, making sure buildings can be seen. Now, whether that's again purposeful so that the people in the offices can look down and say we're in positions of authority, we rule over you or not, that's debatable. So yeah, I can get Brody's point, but I don't necessarily. I think he's maybe a bit too strong in some ways.
No.
You don't have to vote again. But no, it's okay. But the choice of like neoclassical architecture too. I mean, it's like a Janus sort of. On the one hand, it evokes like Athenian democracy,
Yeah.
but also Roman imperialism as well. I mean, this wasn't necessarily.
Well, this is again what happens with when you see after 1916, you end up with these buildings in this neoclassical idiom designed by Filipinos, but they deliberately pick the Greek rather than the
is that
Roman
right? Oh, very interesting.
in order to emphasize democracy. They color buildings white to emphasize purity, and then what they do is they put sculpture on the top that references the regional sense of place to emphasize this is a Philippine building. Now, Parsons clearly is not interested in that. He's simply coming, it's a dream job for him in many ways. He was pretty well paid by local standards. He was able to engage in private practice as well. So he pretty much had free reign over what he wanted to do. And again, from reading different sources, I don't know how true it is, but I read that one of the reasons why he left the Philippines was because he disagreed with Filipinism, the Filipinization of the civil service. He believed that it should be the Americans running the show. So I think again, a lot of his buildings are very kind of plain, quite standoffish. But again, it's the authority of we're here, for the first time. The problem is a lot of his buildings are gone now. They've been knocked down, which is an interesting maybe issue about heritage and what's happening with heritage in the Philippines. Because unless it's a building on a list that's deemed therefore to be of some kind of significance, even then it's not safe. Which is like Rizal Park. Rizal Park, just to maybe go back to PowerPoint, excuse me. Okay, here. Okay, this is this vista is protected by law, but they've built the Torre de Manila, as it's called, right behind it, and this is why it's gone to the Supreme Court. And it should be, I think it's the 25th, so 2 weeks tomorrow, the result of this. But it's been, they read this, the case, the petition was brought to the Supreme Court about 2 years ago. Now the last I heard, and I had very good information from two sources, was that the Supreme Court were likely to ask for this to be removed. But what I'm reading now indicates that there may be some kind of agreement with the city government. In which case, again, I choose my words carefully, but knowing who the mayor is, I don't see much changing.
The former president who's no mayor.
Yes. Yeah. But again, this is important. What I'm trying to, what I think is important, that these spaces are part of the cultural heritage, and they're not necessarily seen that way a lot of the times in the Philippines. And again, because they're not seen that way, there's therefore no legal protection, and things happen to them. And I think again, what is really interesting about the Philippines, and as Mark said, it's got this very interesting colonial narrative in the sense that there's two narratives. But when you come to, say, city planning, when you get to the post-colonial scenario, kind of urban design flies out the window. It just ends. So, it's not as if they go on some different trajectory and then argue, as say Renato Constantino, who's quite rightly critical, because he's coming from this post-colonial perspective and saying, look how it changed us, and is it really for the better, and what have we become? That's the fundamental question of his writing, and you can see that. But there's no, as I said, no kind of, it's all now neoliberalistic shopping development. And,
Very unfamiliar in Hong Kong.
Yeah, and the thing with, say, Philippine cities as well is they do not have, it's known today that if you want an urban environment that works well, you need about 30% of cities to have space. So that's parks, that's roads. Manila, for instance, is less than 15%. So that's one of the problems why it doesn't work. Now again, I'm not being an apologist for American imperialism here, but I'm saying that these are important spaces, or can be very important spaces, not just for identity, but for quality of life, really. And this is why social media has been very important with this. People gone out in the suburbs, and because it's so difficult to physically connect now with the inner city, people didn't realise what was going off until it was really a heritage guy called Carlos Celdran picked up on this, and it kind of blew up. Just the national photo bomber, that's what it's known on social media. But kind of again, people are arguing, what's the rule of law in the Philippines? There's heritage rules, but the National Heritage Commission of the Philippines didn't do anything about this. Just been very quiet, and that's why the Knights of Rizal, which is this really a fraternity, it's an international fraternity, have dared in a way, to get off their backside and petition the court. But even then, the first question the court said, "Why are you bothering us?" So it's been quite a thing for them, but I think it's really going to be, this is a really important legal case. It's going to set a precedence. If they do rule against taking this building down, that's the first of its kind, I think, in Asia. I think there's been a similar one in Turkey to present views of the minarets of mosques. But there's nothing like this in Southeast Asia. So this is, again, a very interesting narrative, I think.
You want to say first? Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I had two questions. So first, thanks for the talk. So my first question was about Baguio, and I was wondering if we could think about Baguio also as a hill station.
Yeah.
Because like Anthony D. King talks about the different types of important colonial spaces, and hill station was something that was very important.
Yeah.
And so when I think of Baguio, I usually think of like a rest area. Where Americans could
there's
recuperate.
the camp.
Yeah.
There was a military.
Yeah.
Focus.
Yeah, so that's one question, sorry. And then
Yeah.
the second one is, I wonder if there were any plans about, or any discussions about redistributing the population when the Burnham Plan would be implemented. Because like in the case of the Spanish Plaza Mayor, most of the wealthy people would be living around the plaza. And then also there's the idea that civilization was defined by by the people who could hear the bells.
Yeah, exactly.
So
within the bells.
So I
Within
was
the
wondering
bells.
if there's any idea about how the
Well, no, I don't think there was like a within the park American equivalent. But no, I think in places like Baguio, for instance, there were certain areas like Pacdal was to be created for essentially elites. And again, plots were to be very, very big. And again, a part of that rhetoric was, the city fits into the landscape. So it was deliberately to be low density. There was a number of rules as well, things like you couldn't park your car on the roads and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, you're right. Baguio had a number of purposes. One was to develop an economy. One was to be a camp for the military, Camp John Hay. One was one of the things I've read a lot was it was about trying to get Filipino elites to stop spending money in Europe, investing in properties in places like Spain, and instead to invest in the Philippines. So there's again a number of things to it, but it's interesting again. Burnham Park is now under threat. The mayor wants to build a multi-story car park there. So these kind of environments are completely different, or will potentially could be very different from what they were intended to be. But no, not so much. One of the things about Baguio was there was, I think, a Spanish sanatorium there, but basically nothing, just a few huts and things. So essentially it was just a complete, literally greenfield site, which therefore again is a planner's dream, you know, because you can do whatever you want. So that really allows your imagination to run, and by all accounts Burnham went up there on a horse and thought it was a fantastic site. And I think again that's the thing a lot when you read about architecture, if you've got a good site, you've got to be a bit of an idiot to design a bad building or a bad city. Does that maybe answer the question a bit?
Yeah, I guess
Okay.
Yeah, just one comment and one question. Excuse for my voice. The first one, the comment is that maybe in your research, you have. I mean, have you mentioned anything about the French Revolution, the Osmond plan of Paris, the Baroque plan of Paris?
Yeah.
You know, La Fond in Washington,
Vienna, the
for
ring
example.
Yeah.
And because I think that Baroque is not just power control.
No.
Liberation, the balance of power of the king and sort of the church,
Yeah.
etc. So that comment would be really nice
Yeah.
to let the audience know.
Yeah.
The second thing is about, you mentioned about Frederick Olmsted. Has he, was he got in any involvement in the consultation, participation, or any design of the landscape in the Philippines?
No, he was actually meant to come though to the Philippines.
Okay.
Now, it's quite interesting again how this is written. The way it's written was that Lord Olmsted Jr. was approached. There was three people who were approached. I believe it's Charles McKim,
Okay.
Lord Olmsted Jr. and Burnham. And for whatever reason, as I said, Burnham, I don't know whether it was a money reason, but Burnham said, I'll do it for free. But what I found is Burnham was very involved from May 1901, writing letters to the US Secretary of War that he could give advice on various things. So I think it's not quite as clear cut. The history is Olmsted was approached and for whatever reason couldn't go, and Burnham said, I'll go, and that's how he that's the story. But I think it's a bit not quite as cut and dry as that. I think Burnham knew a lot more what was going on. And again, I've been through the archives in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
At the Library of Congress, and there's some very interesting letters and telegrams and things. But no, I think architects want to do their own thing. So unless they need advice, they're not really going to pull in anyone else. Yeah.
Okay.
Time is sort of running out. I think we have time for one more question if there's.
May I know whether the Filipinos case here reflect any kind of examples of spatial segregations, whether segregate between the whites and the locals in the Philippines? And the question followed is whether American kind of colonizations are different from other kinds of colonizers, like British.
In terms of, say, city design?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a huge question.
Big question.
I mean, if you take, say, Hong Kong, I got asked a similar question a while ago about why did the British not do something like this? What the Americans were doing? Well, you see, the British were British tradition of city planning is nothing like the Americans. The British is much more small scale, more to do with public health. The idea of developing city planning evolves through the development of public health and slum clearing to a large degree. And one of the things why the British was so different because they really believed in private property rights. And one of the reasons, again, why the British didn't really had problems with this was legally in Britain until 1880s. You had to pay excessive compensation because of the shock of overcoming private property rights. So it made city planning just impossible. So if you go to Wales, to Cardiff, there is a City Beautiful type environment, but that was on land that was donated by the local aristocrat. which was why it's more kind of grand, and even then it's between a line of trees. He said you can do what you want, but you save the trees. So the trees are at the anchor from which the buildings are arranged, and it's part of the University of Cardiff, the University of Wales in Cardiff now. No, I think the British. No, it's a very different thing. I mean, there are, for instance, schemes in the early 1900s with respect to housing. But that's the Garden City. Mm-hmm. But that's not to say, for instance, that in the British Empire that grand city planning didn't exist, because you have New Delhi. But that's again a very, very particular scheme. And then in comparison to that, you have an equally grand project, which is Canberra, which is City Beautiful, very, very heavily influenced by Burnham. Yeah. But that's part of the demonstration of, after the formation of the Australian Commonwealth in 1901, and the law of the creation of the Commonwealth, where they had to create a new capital city. The capital city couldn't be Sydney or Melbourne, because they couldn't agree on who should be the capital. And again, it says it has to be located at a certain distance between the two. And Canberra was designed by a man from Chicago, which is where Burnham's work came from. So there is, again, the emergence of city beautifulism within the British Empire. But again, importantly, if you compare, say, the City Beautiful in the Philippines with Canberra, it's very much about landscape, and it's very much about this notion of democracy. But I did a piece of writing that compared the two, and I've argued that there's a lot of parallels between things that happened first in the Philippines and then later in Canberra. But I think it's a really tough question, because one of the things about city planning is it's so influenced by local context. A lot of the time, if you have a local administrator who's really determined to do it, and has maybe got someone who's prepared to put money up, things can happen. But in some places, say Hong Kong, unless you're going to do it outside the city, we plan a new area as part of the future development, it just wouldn't happen in the what would be the Victoria colony, because again of private property rights. But the British tradition really, in terms of city planning, is kicked off through the Garden City, and again by the development from site planning, taking it up to a bigger scale, influenced by people again who were trying to develop kind of cottage style architecture, create better housing for the working classes. Raymond Unwin, Barry Parker were the key instigators in it. And I think again, even again with these grand plans in places like Manila, a lot of the proposals, and you mentioned about segregation. Well, the issue of segregation still continued, because the native area of Manila, the Tondo, which is still a very particular area, a very notorious slum. Now, that's not to say that there was ever plans to deal with it. The Americans are making reference to it by the 1920s, and in fact, it's Imelda Marcos. They were going to build a wall around it, and she pulled the money out, put the money into something else. Because she was writing books on landscape architecture and things. She was very interested. So there's
having them written for her.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. But as you say, segregation obviously continued, because the Americans were not going to live near an area like Tondo 100 or so years ago. And again, with the development of places like Baguio, it was very clear, if you've got money, you can live away, you can live near the golf club. It's about playing polo, it's about playing golf, it's about a place of leisure. You get out of Manila and you get away from it, and you enjoy the fresh air, and you enjoy the pine trees, and it's a very different urbanism that was being promoted.
And with Tondo, I mean, it was established because the Chinese were not allowed to live in Intramuros.
Yes, I mean, Tondo was a native area.
Yeah.
I think even pre-colonial was a native kingdom, wasn't it? Part of one of the kingdoms. Yeah, Binondo. Binondo is the Chinese. The converted Chinese.
Yeah.
The converted Chinese. Yeah.
Ian, I wanted to thank you again for a
thank you.
fascinating talk, and I have to just say this, it was well worth the wait.
Thank you very much, I appreciate it.